Chapter 4. The Disappearance of Liberal Education. Countries of the West are committed to universal, free, compulsory education. The United States first made this commitment and has extended it further than any other. In this country, 92.5% of the children who are 14 years old and 71.3% of those between 14 and 17 are in school. It will not be suggested that they are receiving the education that the democratic ideal requires. The West has not accepted the proposition that the democratic ideal demands liberal education for all. In the United States, at least, the prevailing opinion seems to be that the demands of that ideal are met by universal schooling rather than by universal liberal education. What goes on in school is regarded as of relatively minor importance. The object appears to be to keep the child off of the labor market and to detain him in comparatively sanitary surroundings until we are ready to have him go to work. The result of universal free compulsory education in America can be acceptable only on the theory that the object of the schools is something other than education, that it is, for example, to keep the young from cluttering up homes and factories during a difficult period of their lives, or that it is to bring them together for social or recreational purposes. These last purposes, those which are social and recreational, the American educational system on a very low level achieves. It throws young people together. Since this does not take any greater effort than is required to pass compulsory school laws and build buildings, the accomplishment of this purpose would not at first blush seem to be a matter for boasting, yet we often hear of it as something we should be proud of, and even as something that should suggest to us the main line of a sound educational policy. We often hear that bringing young people together, having them work and play together, and having them organize themselves democratically are the great contributions to democracy that the educational system can make. This is an expansion of the doctrine that was popular in my youth about the moral benefits conferred on everybody through intercollegiate athletics, which was, in turn, an adaptation of the remark dubiously imputed to the Duke of Wellington about the relationship between the Battle of Waterloo and the playing fields of Eton. No one can deny the value of getting together, of learning to get along with others, of coming to appreciate the methods of organization and the duties of membership in an organization any more than one can deny the importance of physical health and sportsmanship. It seems, on the face of it, a trifle absurd, however, to go to the trouble of training and engaging teachers, of erecting laboratories and libraries, and of laying out a program of instruction and learning if in effect the curriculum is extra and the extra curriculum is the heart of the matter. It seems doubtful whether purposes of the educational system can be found in the pursuit of objects that the Boy Scouts, YMCA, and the local country club, to say nothing of the family and the church, purport to be pursuing. The unique function of the educational system would appear to have something to do with the mind. No other agency in the community sets itself up or is set up to train the mind. To the extent to which the educational system is diverted to other objects, to that extent, the mind of the community is neglected. This is not to say that the educational system should not contribute to the physical, social, and moral development of those committed to its charge. But the method of its contribution, apart from the facilities for extracurriculum activities that it provides, is through the mind. The educational system seeks to establish the rational foundations for good physical, moral, and social behavior. These rational foundations are the result of liberal education. Education is supposed to have something to do with intelligence. It was because of this connection that it was always assumed that if people were to have political power, they would have to have education. They would have to have it if they were to use their power intelligently. This was the basis of the Western commitment to universal free compulsory education. I have suggested that the kind of education that will develop the requisite intelligence for democratic citizenship is liberal education, education through great books and the liberal arts, the kind of education that has all but disappeared from the schools, colleges, and universities of the United States. Why did this education disappear? It was the education of the Founding Fathers. It held sway until 50 years ago. Now it is almost gone. I attribute this phenomenon to two factors: internal decay and external confusion. By the end of the first quarter of this century, great books and the liberal arts had been destroyed by their teachers. The books had become the private domain of scholars. The word classics came to be limited to those works which were written in Greek and Latin. Whitehead refers to Wordsworth's remark about men of science who, quote, murder to dissect, and properly observes, quote, in the past, classical scholars have been veritable assassins compared to them. The classical books, it was thought, could be studied only in the original languages, and a student might attend courses in Plato and Lucretius for years without discovering that they had any ideas. His professor was unlikely to be interested in ideas. They were interested in philological details. The liberal arts in their hands degenerated into meaningless drill. Their reply to criticism and revolt was to demand, forgetting that interest in an essential education, that their courses be required. By the end of the first quarter of the century, the great Greek and Latin writers were studied only to meet requirements for entrance to or graduation from college. Behind these tariff walls, the professors, who had many of the great writers and much of the liberal arts in their charge, contentedly sat, oblivious of the fact that they were depriving the rising generation of an important part of it, and oblivious also of the fact that they were depriving themselves of the reason for their existence. Philosophy, history, and literature, and the disciplines that broke away from philosophy, political science, sociology, and psychology, suffered from another kind of decay, which resulted from a confusion that I shall refer to later, a confusion about the nature and scope of the scientific method. This confusion widened the break between those disciplines that split off from philosophy. It led professors of these disciplines up many blind alleys, and it produced profound changes in philosophical study. The same influences cut the heart out of the study of history and literature. In general, the professors of the humanities and the social sciences and history, fascinated by the marvels of experimental natural science, were overpowered by the idea that similar marvels could be produced in their own fields by the use of the same methods. They also seemed convinced that any results obtained in these fields by any other methods were not worth achieving. This automatically ruled out writers previously thought great who had had the misfortune to live before the method of empirical natural science had reached its present predominance, and who had never thought of applying it to problems and subject matters outside the range of empirical natural science. The insights of these writers were at once out of date, for they could, in the nature of the case, represent little but prejudice or guesswork, which it would be the object of the scientific method to sweep out of the way of progress. Since the aim of philosophers, historians, and critics of literature and art, to say nothing of social scientists, was to be as scientific as possible, they, quote, scientific as possible, they could not concern themselves much with ideas or with the, quote, unscientific tradition of the West, nor could they admit the utility of the liberal arts apart from those associated with mathematics. Meanwhile, the idea of education for all became firmly established in the United States. The school-leaving age steadily rose. An unprecedented flood of pupils and students overwhelmed the schools, colleges, and universities, a flood that has gone on growing with minor fluctuations to this day. Merely to house and staff the educational enterprise was an undertaking that would have put a strain on the wealth and intelligence of any country. The triumphs of industrialization, which made this educational expansion possible, resulted from the triumphs of technology, which rested on triumphs of science, which were promoted by specialization. Experimental science, technology, and industrialization were new. Great books and the liberal arts were identified in the public mind with dead languages, arid routines, and archaic, pre-scientific past. The march of progress could be speeded by getting rid of them, public thought, and using scientific method and specialization for the double purpose of promoting technological advance and curing the social maladjustments that industrialization brought with it. This program would have the incidental value of restoring interest to its place in education and of preparing the young to take part in the new, specialized, scientific, technological, industrial, democratic society that was emerging, to join in raising the standard of living and in solving the dreadful problems that the effort to raise it was creating. The revolt against liberal education was not justified, neither was the belief that the method of experimental science could replace the methods of history, philosophy, and the arts. And the arts. As is common in educational discussion, the public had confused names and things. The dissectors and drill masters had no more to do with liberal education than the ordinary college of liberal arts has to do with those arts today. And the fact that a method obtains sensational results in one field is no guarantee that it will obtain any results whatever in another. Do science, technology, industrialization, and specialization render the great conversation irrelevant? We have seen that industrialization makes liberal education more necessary than ever, and that the leisure it provides makes liberal education possible for the first time for everybody. We have observed that the reorganization of the liberal education would enable everybody to get a liberal education and to become a specialist as well. I should like to add that specialization, instead of making the great conversation irrelevant, makes it more pertinent than ever. Specialization makes it harder to carry on any kind of conversation, but this calls for greater effort, not the abandonment of the attempt. There can be a little argument about the proposition that the task of the future is the creation of a community. Community seems to depend on communication. This requirement is not met by improvements in transportation or in mail, telegraph, telephone, or radio services. The internet. These technological advances are frightening rather than reassuring, and disruptive rather than unifying. In such a world as we have today, they are the means of bringing an enemy's bombs or propaganda into our homes. The effectiveness of modern methods of communication in promoting a community depends on whether there is something intelligible and human to communicate. This, in turn, depends on a common language, a common stock of ideas, and common human standards. These, the great conversation affords. Reading these books should make a man feel himself a member of the species and tradition that these books come from. He should recognize the ties that bind him to his fellow members of the species and tradition. He should be able to communicate in a real sense with other men. Must the specialist be excluded from the community? If so, there can hardly be one, for increasingly in the West, everybody is a specialist. The task is to have a community, nevertheless, and to discover means of using specialties to promote it. This can be done through the great conversation, though through it, the expert can discover the great common principles that underlie the specialties. Through it, he can bring ideas to bear upon his experience. In the light of the great conversation, his special brand of knowledge loses its particularistic vices and becomes a means of penetrating the great books. The mathematical specialist, for example, can get faster into the great mathematicians than a reader who is without his specialized training. With the help of great books, specialized knowledge can radiate out into a genuine interfiltration of common learning and common life. Imagine the younger generation studying great books and learning the liberal arts. Imagine an adult population continuing to turn to the same sources of strength, inspiration, and communication. We could talk to one another then. We should be even better specialists than we are today because we could understand the history of our specialty and its relation to all the others. We would be better citizens and better men. We might turn out to be the nucleus of the world community. Chapter 5. Experimental Science. The great conversation began before the beginnings of experimental science, but the birth of the conversation and the birth of science were simultaneous. The earliest of the pre-Socratics were investigating and seeking to understand natural phenomena. Among them were men who used mathematical notation for this purpose. Even experimentation is not new. It has been going on for hundreds of years. But faith in the experiment as an exclusive method is a modern manifestation. The experimental method has won such clear and convincing victories that it is now regarded in some quarters not only as the sole method of building up scientific knowledge, but also as the sole method of obtaining knowledge of any kind. Thus, we are often told that any question that is not answerable by the empirical methods of science is not really answerable at all, or at least not by significant and verifiable statements. Exceptions may be made with regard to the kinds of questions mathematicians or logicians answer by their methods, but all other questions must be submitted to the methods of experimental research or empirical inquiry. If they are not answerable by these methods, they are the sort of questions that should have never been asked in the first place. At best, they are questions we can answer only by guesswork or conjecture. At worst, they are meaningless, or as the saying goes, nonsensical questions. Genuinely significant problems, in contrast, get their meaning in large part from the scientific operations of observation, experiment, and measurement by which they can be solved. And the solutions, when discovered by these methods, are better than guesswork or opinion. They are supported by fact. They have been tested and are subject to further verification. We are told, furthermore, that the best answers we can obtain by the scientific method are never more than probable. We must free ourselves, therefore, from the illusion that outside of mathematics and logic, we can attain necessary and certain truth. Statements that are not mathematical or logical formulae may look as if they were necessarily or certainly true, but they only look like that. they cannot really be either necessary or certain. In addition, if they have not been subjected to empirical verification, they are far from being necessarily true, not even established as probable. Such statements can be accepted provisionally as working assumptions or hypotheses if they are acceptable at all. Perhaps it is better, unless circumstances compel us to take another course, not to accept such statements at all. Consider, for example, statements about God's existence or the immortality of the soul. These are answers to questions that cannot be answered, one way or the other, by the experimental method, if that is the only method by which probable and verifiable knowledge is attainable. We are debarred from having knowledge about God's existence or the immortality of the soul. If modern man, accepting the view that he can claim to know only what can be demonstrated by experiment or verified by empirical research, still wishes to believe in these things, he must acknowledge that he does so by religious faith or by the exercise of his will to believe, and he must be prepared to be regarded in certain quarters as hopelessly superstitious. It is sometimes admitted that many propositions that are affirmed by intelligent people, such as that democracy is the best form of government, or that world peace depends upon world government, cannot be tested by the method of experimental science. But it is suggested that this is simply because the method is still not fully developed. When our use of the method matures, we shall find out how to employ it in answering every genuine question. Since many propositions in the great conversation have not been arrived at by experiment or have not been submitted to empirical verification, we often hear that the conversation, though perhaps interesting to the antiquarian as setting forth the bizarre superstition entertained by, quote, thinkers before the dawn of experimental science, can have no relevance for us now, when experimental science and its methods have at least revealed these superstitions for what they are. We are urged to abandon the reactionary notion that the earlier voices in the conversation are even now saying something worth listening to, and supplicated to place our trust in the experimental method as the only source of valid or verifiable answers to questions of every sort. One voice in the great conversation itself announces this modern point of view. In the closing paragraph of his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, David Hume writes, quote, "When we run over libraries, persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." The books that Hume and his followers, the positivists of our own day, would commit to burning, or what is the same, to dismissal from serious consideration, do not reflect ignorance or neglect on Hume's principles. Those books written after as well as before Hume argue the case against the kind of positivism that asserts that everything except mathematics and experimental science is sophistry and illusion. They state and defend propositions quite opposite to those of Hume. The Great Conversation, in short, contains both sides of the issue that in modern times is thought to have a most critical bearing on the significance of the Great Conversation itself. Only an unashamed dogmatist would dare to assert that the issue has been finally resolved now in favor of the view that, outside of logic or mathematics, the method of modern science is the only method to employ in seeking knowledge. The dogmatist who made this assertion would have to be more than ashamed. He would have to blind himself to the fact that his own assertion was not established by the experimental method, nor made as an indisputable conclusion of mathematical reasoning or of purely logical analysis. With regard to this issue about the scientific method, which has become central in our own day, the contrary claim is not made for the great conversation. It would be equally dogmatic to assert that the issue has been resolved in favor of the opposite point of view. What can be justly claimed, however, is that the great books ably present both sides of the issue and throw light on aspects of it that are darkly as well as dogmatically treated in contemporary discussion. They raise the question for us of what is meant by science and the scientific method. If all that is meant is that a scientist is honest and careful and precise, and that he weighs all the evidence with discrimination before he pronounces judgment, then we can agree that the scientific method is the only method of reaching and testing the truth in any field. But this conception of the scientific method is so broad as to include the methods used by competent historians, philosophers, and theologians. Since the beginning of time. And it is not helpful, indeed, it is seriously misleading to name a method used in all fields after one of them. Sometimes the scientific method seems to mean that we must pay attention to the facts, which carries with it the suggestion that those who do not believe that the method of experimental science is appropriate to every other field of inquiry do not pay attention to the facts and are therefore remote from reality. The great books show, on the contrary, that even those thinkers of the past, who are now often looked upon as the most reactionary, the medieval theologians, insisted, as Aristotle had before them, that the truth of any statement is its conformity to reality or fact, and that since experience is required to discover the particular matters of fact that test the truth of general statements about the nature of things, and that sense experience is required. S-E-N-S-E. Quote, in the knowledge of nature, Aristotle writes, the test of principles, quote, is the unimpeachable evidence of the senses as to each fact. He holds that, quote, lack of experience diminishes our power of taking a comprehensive view of the admitted facts. Hence, those who dwell in intimate association with nature and its phenomena grow more and more able to formulate as the foundation of their theories principles such as to admit of a wide and coherent development, while those whom devotion to abstract discussions has rendered unobservant of the fact are too ready to dogmatize on the basis of a few observations. Theories should be credited, Aristotle insists, only if what they affirm agrees with the observed facts. Centuries later, an experimental physiologist such as William Harvey says neither more nor less when he declares that to test whether anything has been well or ill advanced, to ascertain whether some falsehood does not lurk under a proposition, it is imperative on us to bring it to the proof of sense, and to admit or reject it on the decision of sense. To proclaim the necessity of observing the facts and all the facts is not to say, however, that merely collecting facts will solve a problem of any kind. The facts are indispensable. They are not sufficient. To solve a problem, it is necessary to think. It is necessary to think even to decide what facts to collect. Even the experimental scientist cannot avoid being a liberal artist, and the best of them, as the great books show, are men of imagination and of theory as well as patient observers of particular facts. Those who have condemned thinkers who have insisted on the importance of ideas have often overlooked the equal insistence of these writers on obtaining the facts. These critics have themselves frequently misunderstood the scientific method and have confused it with the aimless accumulation of data. When the various meanings of science and scientific method are distinguished and clarified, the issue remains whether the method associated with experimental science, as that has developed in modern times, is the only method of seeking the truth about what really exists or about what men and societies should do. As already pointed out, both sides of this issue are taken and argued in the great conversation, but the great books do more than that. They afford us the best examples of man's effort to seek the truth, both about the nature of things and about human conduct, by methods other than those of experimental science. They afford us the best examples of man's efforts to seek the truth, both about the nature of things and about human conduct, by methods other than those of experimental science. And because these examples are presented in the context of equally striking examples of man's efforts to learn by experiment, or the method of empirical science, the great books provide us with the best materials for judging whether the experimental method is or is not the only acceptable method of inquiry into all things. That judgment the reader of the great books must finally make for himself. When he makes it in the light of the best examples of the employment of different methods to solve the problems of different subject matters, he will not have begged the question, as do those who, before reading the great books, judge them in terms of the dogma that there is only one method, and that though there are obvious differences among subject matters, no knowledge about any subject matter can be achieved unless this one method is applied. On one point, there seems to be no question. The contemporary practices of scientific research, as well as the scientific efforts that the great books record, show beyond doubt that the method of the controlled experiment under artificial conditions is not the only method used by men who regard themselves and are regarded as scientists. It may represent the most perfect form of empirical inquiry. It may be the model on which all the less exact forms of scientific investigation are patterned. But as the work of astronomers, biologists, and social scientists reveals, experiment in the strict sense is not always possible. The method of the controlled experiment under artificial conditions is exclusively the method of that part of science, the subject matter of which permits it to be experimental. On the assumption that non-living matter always behaves in the same way under the same conditions, we are justified in concluding from experiment that we have discovered how certain non-living matter behaves under certain conditions. On the assumption that living matter, when very large numbers of units are taken into account, is likely to exhibit uniformities of behavior under identical conditions, we are justified in concluding that if we know the conditions are identical, which is possible only in the laboratory, and if we know that the number of units under certain examination is large enough, then probably such uniformities of behavior as we direct will recur under identical conditions. The griefs and losses sustained by those social scientists who predict the outcome of horse races and presidential elections are sufficient to indicate the difficulties of their subject. No one would propose that the social scientists should not keep on trying. The more refined and complete our knowledge of society, the better off we shall be. But it would be helpful to the social scientists if they recognize that in understanding human beings, who often cannot be subjected to experiment in the laboratory like guinea pigs and atoms, the method of experimental science cannot, in the nature of things, produce results that can compare with those which science achieves in dealing with matters more susceptible to experimentation. One eminent social scientist, Professor Robert Redfield, has suggested that his colleagues consider their relation to the humanities as well as to the natural sciences. Quote, "The imitation of the physical and biological sciences," he says, "has proceeded to a point where the fullest development of social science is hampered. Identification with the natural sciences shelters the social scientist, quote, from a stimulation from philosophy and the arts and literature which social science needs. The stimulation which the social scientists can gain from the humanities can come from the arts and literature themselves and through an understanding of some of the problems which interest philosophers and the more imaginative students of the creative productions of mankind. According to Professor Redfield, the bond that links the social scientist and the humanist is their common subject. Matter. Humanity, he says. It is the common subject matter of those who look at men as they are represented in books or works of art, and of those who look at men as they appear in institutions and in directly visible action. It is the central and essential matter of interest to social scientists and humanists alike. Though they differ in their methods, they, quote, share a common effort, a common interest. And Redfield adds, it may be doubted if the results so far achieved by the social scientists are more communicative of the truth about human nature than are the results achieved by the more personal and imaginative methods of the artist. We should remember such sound advice when we are urged to abandon methods that have yielded important insights in favor of one that will doubtless be helpful, but may not be able to tell us everything we need to know. It may be unwise to reject the sources of wisdom that have been traditionally found in history, philosophy, and the arts. These disciplines do not give us mathematical knowledge or knowledge acquired in the laboratory, but to say that for these reasons what they give us is not knowledge in any sense is to disregard the facts and to put the world of knowable things in a dogmatic straitjacket. The rise of experimental science has not made the great conversation irrelevant. Experimental science is a part of the conversation. As Etienne Gilson has remarked, quote, our science is a part of our humanism, as, quote, the science of Pericles' time was a part of the Greek humanism. Science is itself part of the great conversation. In the conversation, we find science raising issues about knowledge and reality. In the light of the conversation, we can reach a judgment about the question in dispute. How many valid methods of inquiry are there? Because of experimental science, we now know a very large number of things about the natural world of which our predecessors were ignorant. In this set of books, we can observe the birth of science, applaud the development of the experimental technique, and celebrate the triumphs it has won. But we can also note the limitations of the method and mourn the errors that its misapplication has caused. We can distinguish the outlines of those great persistent problems that the method of experimental natural science may never solve, and find the clues to their solutions offered by other disciplines and other methods. Yeah, at some point we stopped caring about myths and legends, and had more respect for technology. Then story is about people that did great things. But it's not just about getting to the bottom of questions, studying literature and philosophy and all that. The way of science isn't about that either. Isn't only about that. And who says it's even that important that we learn anything anyway? Maybe we just like to do stuff that makes us happy. Chapter 6. Education for all. We have seen that education through the liberal arts and great books is the best education for the best. We have seen that the democratic ideal requires the attempt to help everybody get this education. We have seen that none of the great changes, the rise of experimental science, specialization, and industrialization, makes this attempt irrelevant. On the contrary, these changes make the effort to give everybody this education more necessary and urgent. We must now return to the most important question, which is, can everybody get this education? When an educational ideal is proposed, we are entitled to ask in what measure it can be achieved. If it cannot be achieved at all, those who propose it may properly be accused of irresponsibility or disingenuousness. Such accusations have in fact been leveled against those who propose the ideal of liberal education for all. Many sincere Democrats believe that those who propose this ideal must be anti-democratic. Some of these critics are carried away by an educational version of the doctrine of guilt by association. They say, the ideal that you propose was put forward by and for aristocrats. Aristocrats are not Democrats. Therefore, neither you nor your ideal is democratic. The answer to this criticism has already been given. Liberal education was aristocratic in the sense that it was the education of those who enjoyed leisure and political power. If it was the right education for those who had leisure and political power, then it is the right education for everybody today. That all should be well acquainted with, and each in his measure actively and continuously engaged in a great conversation that man has had about what is and should be, does not seem on the face of it an anti-democratic desire. It is only anti-democratic if, in the name of democracy, it is erecting an ideal for all that all cannot, in fact, achieve. But if this educational ideal is actually implicit in the democratic ideal, as it seems to be, then it should not be refused because of its association with a past in which the democratic ideal was not accepted. Many convinced believers in liberal education attack the ideal of liberal education for all on the grounds that if we attempt to give liberal education for all or to everybody, we shall fail to give it to anybody. They point to the example of the United States, where liberal education has virtually disappeared, and say that this catastrophe is the inevitable result of taking the dogma of equality of educational opportunity seriously. The two criticisms I have mentioned come to the same thing, that liberal education is too good for the people. The first group of critics and the second unite in saying that only the few can acquire an education that was best for the best. The difference between the two is in the estimate they place on the importance of the loss of liberal education. The first group says that since everybody cannot acquire a liberal education, democracy cannot require that anybody should have it. The second group says that since everybody cannot acquire a liberal education, the attempt to give it to everybody will necessarily result in an inferior education for everybody. The remedy is to segregate the few who are capable from the many who are incapable, and see to it that the few, at least, receive a liberal education. The rest can be relegated to vocational training or any kind of activity in school that happens to interest them. The more logical and determined members of this second group of critics will confess that they believe that the great mass of mankind is, and of right, ought to be condemned to a modern version of natural slavery. Hence, there is no use of wasting educational effort upon them. They should be given such training as will be necessary to enable them to survive. Since all attempts to do more will be frustrated by the facts of life, such attempts should not be made. Because the great bulk of mankind have never had the chance to get a liberal education and cannot be proved that they can get it. Neither can it be proved that they cannot. The statement of the ideal, however, is of value in indicating the direction that education should take. For example, if it is admitted that the few can profit by liberal education, then we ought to make sure that they, at least, have the chance to get it. It is almost impossible for them to do so in the United States today. Many claims can be made for the American people, but nobody would think of claiming that they can read, write, and figure. Still less would it be maintained that they understand the tradition of the West, the tradition in which they live. The products of American high schools are illiterate, and a degree from a famous college or university is no guarantee that the graduate is in any case better. One of the most remarkable features of American society is that the difference between the uneducated and the educated is so slight. The reason for this phenomenon is, of course, that so little education takes place in American educational institutions. But we still have to wrestle with the question of why this should be so. Is there so little education in the American educational system because that system is democratic? Are democracy and education incompatible? Do we have to say that if everybody is to go to school, the necessary consequence is that nobody will be educated? Since we do not know that everybody cannot get a liberal education, it would seem that if this is the ideal education, we ought to try to help everybody get it. Those especially who believe in, quote, getting the facts and, quote, the experimental method should be the first to insist that until we have tried, we cannot be certain that we shall fail. The business of saying, in advance of a serious effort, that the people are not capable of achieving a good education is too strongly reminiscent of the opposition to every extension of democracy. The opposition has always rested on the allegation that the people were incapable of exercising intelligently the power they demanded. Always the historic statement has been verified. You cannot expect the slave to show the virtues of the free man unless you first set him free. When the slave has been set free, he has, in the passage of time, become indistinguishable from those who have always been free. There appears to be an innate human tendency to underrate the capacity of those who do not belong to, quote, our group. Those who do not share our background cannot have our ability. Foreigners, people who are in a different economic status, and the young seem invariably to be regarded as intellectually backward and constitutionally so by natives, people in, quote, our economic status, and adults. In addition, for example, when a proposal is made that looks toward increased intellectual effort on the part of students, professors will always say that the students cannot do the work. My observation leads me to think that what this usually means is that the professors cannot or will not do the work that the suggested change requires. When, in spite of the opposition of the professors, the change has been introduced, the students, in my experience, have always responded nobly. We cannot argue that because those Irish peasant boys who became priests in the Middle Ages, or those sons of American planters and businessmen who became the founding fathers of our country, were expected, as a matter of course, to acquire their education through the liberal arts and great books. Every person can be expected, as a matter of course, to acquire such an education today. We do not know the intelligent quotients of the medieval priests or of the founding fathers. They were probably high. But such evidence as we have in our own time, derived from the experience of 2 or 3 colleges that have made the great conversation the basis of their course of study, and from the experience of that large number of groups of adults who every part of the United States suggests that the difficulties of extending this educational program to everybody may have been exaggerated. Great books are great teachers. They are showing us every day what ordinary people are capable of. These books came out of ignorant, inquiring humanity. They are usually the first announcements of success in learning. Most of them were written for and addressed to ordinary people. If many great books seem unreadable and unintelligible to the most learned as well as to the dullest, it may be because we have not for a long time learned to read by reading them. Great books teach people not only how to read them, but also how to read all other books. This is not to say that any great book is altogether free from difficulty. As Aristotle remarked, learning is accompanied by pain. There is a sense in which every great book is always over the head of the teacher. We can never fully comprehend it. That is why the books in this set are infinitely readable. That is why these books are great teachers. They demand the attention of the reader and keep his intelligence on the stretch. As Whitehead has said, whenever a book is written of real educational worth, you may be quite certain that some reviewer will say that it will be difficult to teach from it. Of course it will be difficult to teach from it. If it were easy, the book ought to be burned, for it cannot be educational. In education, as elsewhere, the broad primrose path leads to a nasty place. In education, as elsewhere, the broad primrose path. Primrose. What does that sound familiar? But are we to say that because these books are more difficult than detective stories, pulp magazines, and textbooks, therefore they are to remain the private property of scholars? Are we to hold that different rules obtain for books on the one hand and painting, sculpture, and music on the other? We do not confine people to looking at poor pictures and listening to poor music on the ground that they cannot understand good pictures and good music. We urge them to look at as many good pictures and hear as much good music as they can, convinced that this is the way in which they will come to understand and appreciate art and music. We would not recommend inferior substitutes because we would be sure that they would degrade the public taste rather than lead it to better things. If only the specialist is to be allowed access to these books on the ground that it is impossible to understand them without, quote, scholarship. If the attempt to understand them without scholarship is to be condemned as irremediable superficiality, then we shall be compelled to shut out the majority of mankind from some of the finest creations of the human mind. This is aristocracy with a vengeance. Sir Richard Livingstone said, "No doubt a trained student will understand Aeschylus, Plato, Erasmus, and Pascal better than the man in the street, but that does not mean that the ordinary man cannot get a lot out of them. Am I not allowed to read Dante because he is full of contemporary allusions and my knowledge of his period is almost nil? Or Shakespeare because if I had to do a paper on him in the Oxford Honours School of English Literature, I should be lucky to get a 4th class? Am I not to look at a picture by Velasquez or Cezanne because I shall not understand and appreciate them far less than a painter or art critic would? Are you going to postpone any acquaintance with these great things to a day when we are all sufficiently educated to understand them, a day that shall never come? No. Sensible people read great books and look at great pictures knowing very little of Plato or Cezanne, or of the influences which molded the thought or art of these men, quite aware of their own ignorance, but in spite of it getting a lot out of what they read or see." Sir Richard goes on to refer to the marks of T.S. Eliot. Quote, "In my own experience, of the appreciation of poetry, I have always found that the less I knew about the poet and his work before I began to read it, the better. An elaborate preparation of historical and biographical knowledge has always been to me a barrier. It is better to be spurred to acquire scholarship because you enjoy the poetry than to suppose that you enjoy the poetry because you have acquired the scholarship. Even more important than the dogma of scholarship and keeping people from the books is the dogma of individual differences. This is one of the basic dogmas of American education. It runs like this: all men are different. Therefore, all men require a different education. Therefore, anybody who suggests that their education should be in any respect the same has ignored the fact that all men are different. Therefore, nobody suggests that everybody should read some of the same books. Some people should read some books, some should read others. This dogma has gained such a hold on the minds of American educators that you will now often hear a college president boast that his college has no curriculum. Each student has a course of study framed or tailored, is the usual word, to meet his own individual needs and interests. We should not linger long in discussing the question of whether a student at the age of 18 should be permitted to determine the actual content of his education for himself. As we have a tendency to underrate the intelligence of the young, we have a tendency to overrate their experience and the significance of the expression of interests and needs on the part of those who are inexperienced. Educators ought to know better than their pupils what an education is. If educators do not, they have wasted their lives. The art of teaching consists, in large part, of interesting people in things that ought to interest them, but do not. The task of educators is to discover what an education is and then to invent the methods of interesting their students in it. But I do not wish to beg the question. The question, in effect, is this: is there any such thing as an education? The answer that is made by the devotees of the dogma of individual differences is no. There are as many different educations as there are different individuals. It is authoritarian to say that there is any education that is necessary or even suitable for every individual. So, Bertrand Russell once said to me that the pupil in school should study whatever he liked. I asked whether this was a crime against the pupil. Suppose a boy did not like Shakespeare. Should he be allowed to grow up without knowing Shakespeare? And if he did, should he not look back upon his teachers as cheats who had defrauded him of his cultural heritage? Lord Russell replied that he would require a boy to read one play of Shakespeare. If he did not like it, he should not be compelled to read any more. I say that Shakespeare should be a part of the education of everybody. The point at which he is introduced to the course of study, the method of arousing interest in him, the manner in which he is related to the problems of the present may vary as you will. But Shakespeare should be there because of the loss of understanding, because of the impoverishment that results from his absence. The comprehension of the tradition in which we live and our ability to communicate with others who live in the same tradition and to interpret our tradition to those who do not live in it are drastically affected by the omission of Shakespeare from the intellectual and artistic experience of any of us. If any common program is impossible, If there is no such thing as an education that everybody ought to have, then we must admit that any community is impossible. All men are different, but they are also the same. As we must all become specialists, we must all become men. In view of the ample provision that is now made for the training of specialists, in view of the divisive and disintegrative effects of specialism, and in view of the urgent need for unity and community, it does not seem an exaggeration to say that the present crisis calls, first of all, for an education that shall emphasize those respects in which men are the same, rather than those in which they are different. The West needs an education that draws out our common humanity, rather than our individuality. Individual differences can be taken into account in the methods that are employed and in the opportunities for specialization that may come later. In this connection, we might recall the dictum of Rousseau, quote, "It matters little to me whether my pupil is intended for the army, the church, or the law. Before his parents chose a calling for him, nature called him to be a man. When he leaves me, he will be neither a magistrate, a soldier, nor a priest. He will be a man." If there is an education that everybody should have, how is it to be worked out? Educators are dodging their responsibility if they do not make the attempt. And I must confess that I regard the popularity of the dogma of individual differences as a manifestation of a desire on the part of educators to evade a painful but essential duty. The editors of this set believe that these books should be central in education. But if anybody can suggest a program that will better accomplish the object they have in view, they will gladly embrace it, him and it. Education for all. All right, 4 more chapters, about 40 more pages. So far, we read the tradition, chapter 1, the tradition of the West, chapter 2, modern times, chapter 3, education and economics, chapter 4, the disappearance of liberal education, chapter 5, experimental science, and chapter 6, education for all. Next 4 chapters, chapter 7, the education for adults, chapter 8, the next great change, chapter 9, East and West, chapter 10, a letter to the reader. Okay. Chapter 7, the education of adults. Shut up here, back again. Jeez. Okay. Let's go on with the green screen. Chapter 7, the education of adults. The editors believe that these books should be read by all adults all their lives. They concede that this idea has novel aspects. The education of adults has uniformly been designed either to make up for the deficiencies of their schooling, in which case it might terminate when these gaps had been filled, or it has consisted of vocational training, in which case it might terminate when training adequate to the post in question had been gained. What is here proposed is interminable liberal education. Even if the individual has had the best possible liberal education in youth, interminable education through great books and the liberal arts remains his obligation. He cannot expect to store up an education in childhood that will last all his life. What he can do in youth is to acquire the disciplines and habits that will make it possible for him to continue to educate himself all his life. One must agree with John Dewey in this, that continued growth is essential to intellectual life. The twin aims that have animated mankind since the dawn of history are the conquest of nature and the conquest of drudgery. Now they seem in a fair way to be achieved, and the achievement seems destined, at the same time, to end in the trivialization of life. It is impossible to believe that men can long be satisfied with the kind of recreations that now occupy the bulk of their free time. After all, they are men. Man, though an animal, is not all animal. He is rational and cannot live by animal gratifications alone. Still, less by amusements that animals have too much sense to indulge in. A man must use his mind. He must feel that he is doing something that will develop his highest powers and contribute to the development of his fellow men, or he will cease to be a man. The trials of the citizen now surpass anything that previous generations ever knew. Private and public propaganda beats upon him from morning till night all his life long. If independent judgment is the sine qua non of effective citizenship in a democracy, then it must be admitted that such judgment is harder to maintain now than it ever has been before. It is too much to hope that a strong dose of education in childhood and youth can inoculate a man to withstand the onslaughts on his independent judgment that society conducts or allows to be conducted against him every day. For this, constant mental alertness and mental growth are required. The conception of liberal education for adults that is here advanced has an important effect on our conception of education in childhood and youth, its purpose and its content. If we are to expect the whole adult population to engage in liberal education, then the curriculum of schools, colleges, and universities should be constructed with this end in view. At present, it is built upon the notion, which is unfortunately correct, that nobody is ever going to get any education after he gets out of school. Here we encounter the melancholy fact that most of the important things that human beings ought to understand cannot be comprehended in youth. Although I have known several astronomers who were contributing to the international journals before the age of 16, I have never known a child of any age who had much that was useful to say about the organization of human society or the ends of human life. The great books of ethics, political philosophy, economics, history, and literature do not yield up their secrets to the immature. In the United States, if these works are read at all, they are read in school and college, where they can be only dimly understood, and are never read again. Hence, Americans are unlikely to understand them fully. We are deprived of the light they might shed upon our present problems. Here the theory that education must meet immediate needs comes in to complete the chaos in our educational institutions. If the aim of education is to meet the immediate needs of the person educated, and if he is never to have any more education, after he gets out of educational institutions, then he must learn everything he might ever need while he is in these institutions. Since there is no way of telling what the graduate might need, the only way is to offer him a little bit of everything, hoping that he will find some bits useful. The American high school and college are jammed with miscellaneous information on every conceivable subject, from acrobats to Zimmergy. For who can say that some future high-right artist or brewer will not be found among these students? The great, wild proliferation of the curriculum of American schools, colleges, and universities is the result of many influences, but we can say with some assurance that if adult life had been looked upon as a time for continued learning, the pressure toward proliferation would have been measurably reduced. A concern with liberal education for all adults is necessary if we are to have liberal education for anybody, because liberal education can flourish in the schools, colleges, and universities of a country only if the adult population understands and values it. The best way to understand and value something is to have it for yourself. We hear a great deal today about the neglect of the liberal arts colleges and the decay of humanistic and social studies. It is generally assumed that all that these colleges and scholars require is money. If they had more money, their problems would be solved. We are led to believe that their failure to get money results from the obtuseness or perversity of college and university presidents. These officers are supposed to be interested in the development of natural science and technology at the expense of the liberal arts and the humanistic and social studies. One may be permitted to doubt whether the colleges of liberal arts and scholars in the humanities and the social studies could wisely spend more money than they have. The deficiencies of these institutions and individuals who do not seem to result from lack of funds, but from lack of ideas. When the appeal for support of a college is based on the fact that its amenities are almost as gracious as those of the local country club, when scholars in the humanities and social studies, misled by their misconception of the scientific method and by the prestige of natural science, dedicate themselves to the aimless accumulation of data about trivial subjects, the problem does not seem to be financial. Unfortunately, the only problem that money can solve are financial problems. Institutions and subjects develop because people think they are important. The importance comes first, and the money afterward. The importance of experimental science is obvious to everybody. Science produced the atomic bomb, and the medical schools are doing almost as much to lengthen life as the departments of physics and chemistry are doing to shorten it. Many colleges of liberal arts and the researches of many scholars in the humanities and the social studies are important only to those whose livelihood depends upon them. Yet the great issues are there. What is our destiny? What is a good life? How can we achieve a good society? What can we learn to guide us through the mazes of the future from history, philosophy, literature, and the fine arts? These questions lie, for the most part, in the areas traditionally assigned to the liberal arts, the humanities, and the social studies. If through this set of books, or in any other way, the adult population of laymen came to regard these issues as important, if scholars in these fields were actually engaged in wrestling with these problems, if in a large number of homes all over the country these questions were being discussed, then two things would happen. It would become respectable for intelligent young people with ideals, to devote their lives to the study of these issues, as it is respectable to be a scientist or an engineer today. And the colleges of liberal arts and scholars in the humanities and the social studies would receive all the support they could use. An axiomatic educational proposition is that what is honored in a country will be cultivated there. One object of this set of books is to do honor to the great tradition of the West, and the conviction that this is the way in which to promote its cultivation, elaboration, and extension, and to perpetuate it to posterity. I'm curious if this is really going to feel like a good use of time at all. Once I get into the Syntopicon. Chapter 1, Angel. Introduction. Influenced by a long tradition of religious symbolism in painting and poetry, our imagination responds to the word angel, by picturing a winged figure robed in dazzling white and having the bodily aspect of a human being. The image common to believers and unbelievers contains features which represent some of the elements of meaning and the abstract conception of angels, as this is found in the writings of Jewish and Christian theologians and in related discussions. Man, these pages are dense with text. This is Bible formatting. Multiple columns per page. Yeah. So I would read that maybe one morning, and then the next morning read Animal. It seems kind of dull to do that, but maybe not. Maybe, how much does he have to say about Animal? I feel like it would be a lot more interesting to like read Shakespeare or something. Alphabetical ordering places animal after angel in the list of ideas. There is a third term which belongs with these two, and but for the alphabet might have come between them. The term is man. These three terms, and a fourth, God, which rounds out the comparison, are conjoined in Shakespeare's statement of what is perhaps the most universal reflection of man upon himself. What a piece of work is man, says Hamlet. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. Yeah. I always kind of thought that everybody's like a god in apprehension. For made in his image, it's in regards to what we can understand, not so much in what we can do, but what we can perceive. And each of these, animal, angel, God, and each of these man has seen his image, and at different moments. Maybe I will do that. It seems like it's good writing. I'm pretty sure it's all Mortimer Adler, who I know I like. I'll at least read the preface to the Syntopicon after I finish reading this first volume. And maybe I will get to all these ideas. There's a whole list of them here. I have a feeling it would take many, many hours to read through all these ideas. It might be worth it. Can't really just read Shakespeare by yourself, though. I mean, you can, but one person reading it aloud is, I don't think, ideal as a listener. I'd rather see it performed, ideally, or listen to multiple readers reading the different parts of the plays. What? Got another hour. I'm going to get through these last couple chapters here, but it's fine. Chapter 8. The Next Great Change. Since education is concerned with the future, let us ask ourselves what we know positively about the future. We know that all parts of the world are getting closer together in terms of the mathematical means of transportation and communication. We know that this will continue. The world is going to be unified by conquest or consent. We know that the fact that all parts of the world are getting closer together does not by itself mean greater unity or safety in the world. It may mean that we shall all go up in one great explosion. We know that there is no defense against the most destructive of modern weapons. Both the victor and the defeated will lose the next war. All the factors that formerly protected this country, geographical isolation, industrial strength, and military power, are now obsolete. We know that the anarchy of competing sovereign states must lead to war, sooner or later. Therefore, we must have world law enforced by a world organization, which must be attained through world cooperation and community. We know that it will be impossible to induce all men to agree on all matters. The most we can hope for is to induce all men to be willing to discuss all matters instead of shooting one another about some matters. A civilization in which all men are compelled to agree is not one in which we would care to live. Under such circumstances, one world would be worse than many, for in many worlds there is at least the chance of escape from one to another. The only civilization in which a free man would be willing to live is one that conceives of history as one long conversation leading to clarification and understanding. Such a civilization presupposes communication. Under such circumstances, one world would be the only civilization which a free man would be willing to live is one that conceives of history as one long conversation leading to clarification and understanding. Such a civilization presupposes communication. It does not require agreement. We know that time is of the essence. Every day we read announcements of advances in transportation and advances in destruction. We can now go round the world in the time it used to take to go from New York to Boston, and we can kill 250,000 people with one bomb. We are promised bigger and better instruments of mass murder in every issue of our daily papers. At the same time, the hostility among sovereign states is deepening by the hour. How can we prepare for a future like this? We see at once that the primary, not the incidental, participants in an educational program designed to cope with a future like this must be adults. They are in charge of the world. The rising generation, unless the adults in charge of the world can find some way of living together immediately, may never have a chance to rise. I do not wish to exaggerate the possibilities of adult education through great books and the liberal arts, or by any other means, as a method of preventing war. If all the adults in America could suddenly realize their full human potentialities, which is the object of liberal education, and the government of Russia remained what it is today, we might merely have the satisfaction of being blown up with our full human potentialities realized instead of unrealized. In view of the prevailing skepticism about the immortality of the soul, I cannot expect American readers to regard this as more than a dubious consolation. Yet there will be much argument against the proposition that, on the whole, reasonable and intelligent people, even if they confront aggressively unreasonable or stupid people, have a better chance of attaining their end, which in this case is peace, than if they are themselves unreasonable and stupid. They may even be able by their example to help their opponents to become more reasonable and less stupid. The United States is now the most powerful country in the world. It has been a world power for a very short time. It has not had centuries of experience in which to learn how to discharge the responsibilities of a position into which it was catapulted against its will. Nor has it had the kind of education in the last 50 years that is conducive to understanding its position or to maintaining it with balance, dignity, and charity. An educational system that aims at vocational training or social adjustment or technological advance is not likely to lead the kind of maturity that the present crisis demands of the most powerful nation in the world. A country that is powerful, inexperienced, and uneducated can be a great danger to world peace. The United States is unlikely to endanger peace through malevolence. The people of this country do not appear to bear any ill will toward any other people, nor do they want anything that any other people have. Since they are devoted to their own kind of society and government, they do not want any other nation to threaten the continued prosperity of their society and government. Any military moves made by the United States will be made in the conviction that they are necessary for the defense of this country. What's wrong about that? Well, no, he wasn't wrong about that. All the wars the United States has had started with convincing everybody they were defensive. Since then. But this conviction may be mistaken. It may be hysterical, or it may be ignorant. We can easily blunder into war. Since we may have committed such a blunder even before these words appear in print, I must repeat that I do not wish to exaggerate the importance of these books, or any other means of adult education, as a method of preventing such a blunder. The time is short, and education is long. What I am saying is that since education is long, and since it is indispensable, we should begin it right away. When Marshal Lyautey was in Africa, he asked his gardener to plant a certain tree, the foliage of which he liked very much. The gardener said that a tree of this kind took 200 years to reach maturity. In that case, said the marshal, there is no time to lose. Plant it today. The great conversation symbolizes that civilization of the dialogue, which is the only civilization in which a free man would care to live. It promotes the realization of that civilization here and now. This set of books is organized on the principle of attaining clarification and understanding of the most important issues, as stated by the greatest writers of the West, through continuous discussion. Its object is to project the great conversation into the future and to have everybody participate in it. The community toward which it is hoped that these books may contribute is the community of free minds. Now, the only defense that any nation can have is the character and intelligence of its people. The adequacy of that defense will depend upon the strength of the conviction that the nation is worth defending. This conviction must rest on a comprehension of the values for which that nation stands. In the case of the United States, those values are to be found in the tradition of the West. The tradition of the West is the great conversation. We have repeated to ourselves so much of late the slogan, America must be strong, that we have forgotten what strength is. We appear to believe that strength consists of masses of men and machines. I do not deny that they have their role, but surely the essential ingredients of strength are trained intelligence, love of country, the understanding of its ideals, and such devotion to those ideals that they become a part of the thought and life of every citizen. We cannot hope to make ourselves intelligible to the rest of the world unless we understand ourselves. We now present a confusing picture to other people, largely because we are ourselves confused. To take only one example, how can we say that we are part of the great tradition of the West, the essence of which is that nothing is to be undiscussed, when some of our most representative citizens constantly demand the suppression of freedom of speech in the interest of national security? Now that military power is obsolescent, the national security depends on our understanding of and devotion to such ancient Western liberties as free speech. If we abandon our ideals under external pressure, we give away without a fight what we would be fighting for if we went to war. We abandon the sources of our strength. How can we say that we are defending the tradition of the West if we do not know what it is? An educational program for young people or adults from which this tradition has disappeared fails, of course, to transmit it to our own people. It also fails to convince other people that the bulk of its activity is irrelevant to any of the things we know about the future. Vocationalism, scientism, and specialism can at the most assist our people to earn a living and thus maintain the economy of the United States. They cannot contribute to the much more important elements of national strength, trained intelligence, the understanding of the country's ideals, and devotion to them, nor can they contribute to the growth of a community in this country. They are divisive rather than unifying forces. Vocational training, scientific experimentation, and specialization do not have to support liberal education in order to make their economic contribution. We can have liberal education for all and vocational training, scientific experimentation, and specialization too. We hear a great deal nowadays about international understanding, world community, and world organization. These things are all supposed to be good, but nothing very concrete is put forward as to the method by which they can be attained. We can be positive on one point. We are safe in saying that these things will not be brought about by vocational training, scientific experiment, and specialization. The kind of education we have for young people and adults in the United States today will not advance these causes. I should like to suggest one or two ways in which they may be advanced. We should first dispose of the proposition that we cannot have world organization or world law without a world community. This appears to overlook the obvious interaction between legal institutions and culture. As Aristotle pointed out long ago, law is itself an educational force. The Constitution of the United States educates the people every day to believe in and support the Constitution of the United States. World community, in the sense of perfect understanding among all peoples everywhere, is not required in order to have the beginnings of a world law. What is required is that minimum understanding which is sufficient to allow world law to begin. From that point forward, world law will support world community, and world community will support world law. For example, there are those who oppose the discussion of universal disarmament on the ground that disarmament is an effect and not a cause. They say that until the tensions in the world are removed, disarmament cannot take place, and that we shall simply deceive ourselves if we talk about it instead of doing something about the tensions. Actually, one way to do something about the tensions is to talk about disarmament. The manifestation of a general willingness to disarm under effective international regulation and control would do more to relieve the tensions in the world than any other single thing. Getting together to see whether such a plan could be formulated would relieve tension. No doubt there would be disappointments and the risk of exacerbating international irritations. But to refuse to discuss the principal method of mitigating tensions on the ground that they have to be mitigated before it is discussed does not seem to be the best way to mitigate them. What are the best ways of promoting that minimum of understanding which is necessary to permit world law to begin? If community depends on communication, we must ask what kinds of things can be most readily communicated to and comprehended by the largest number of people, and what kinds of things tell the most about the people who are doing the communicating. It appears that the kind of things that are most intelligible and most revealing are ideas and artistic objects. They are the most readily understood. They are most characteristic of the peoples who have produced or stated them. We can learn more about another people from their artistic and intellectual productions than we can from all the statistics and data that can ever be collected. We can learn more. That is, of what we need to know in order to found a world community. We can learn more in the sense that we can understand more. What we have in this set of books is a means by which people who can read English can understand the West. We in the West can understand ourselves and one another. Peoples in other parts of the world can understand us. This leads to the idea that Scott Buchanan has put forward. The idea of a world republic of law and justice, and a world republic of learning and mutually supporting each other. Any republic maintains its justice, peace, freedom, and order by the exercise of intelligence. Every assent on the part of the governed is a product of learning. A republic is a common educational life and process. So Montesquieu said that as the principle of an aristocracy was honor, and the principle of a tyranny was fear, the principle of a democracy was education. Thomas Jefferson took him seriously. Now we discover that a little learning is a dangerous thing. We see now that we need more learning, more real learning for everybody. The republic of learning is that republic toward which all mere political republics gravitate, and which they must serve if they are to be true to themselves. No one saw this before yesterday, and we only today are able to begin to measure what we should do about it tomorrow. The immediate inference from this insight is a utopia for today. The extension of universal education to every man and woman from childhood to the grave. It is time to take education away from the scholars and school teachers and to open the gates of the republic of learning to those who can and will make it responsible to humanity. Learning is in principle and should be, in fact, the highest common good, to be defended as a right and worked for as an end. All men are capable of learning according to their abilities. Learning does not stop as long as a man lives, unless his learning power atrophies because he does not use it. Political freedom cannot last without provision for the free, unlimited acquisition of knowledge. Truth is not long retained in human affairs without continual learning and relearning. A political order is tyrannical if it is not rational. If we aim at a world republic of law and justice, we must recover and revive the great tradition of liberal human thought, rethink our knowledge in its light and shadow, and set up the devices of learning by which anybody can, perhaps for the first time, become a citizen of the world. The kind of understanding that comes through belonging to the world republic of learning is the kind that constitutes the world community. the world republic of law and justice as nothing but the political expression of the world republic of learning and the world community. Okay. I'm actually almost done. I have easts and wests, and then a letter to the reader. And then I have possible approaches to this set. And then I have the contents of the great... And that's basically it for this. Then you have the contents of the great books, which is kind of interesting. Aristotle, Plato, Herodotus, Aristophanes, Euripides, Aristotle, Hippocrates. Can't believe they translated all these guys to English. Homer, Sophocles. I should get this set just for the ancient Greek stuff. So it would be hard to find all this, like, otherwise probably. All these different writings of theirs. Like Euclid, Archimedes, Nicomachus. Virgil. I have this translation of Virgil, John Dryden, which somehow he made rhyme in English. Couldn't have been easy. I wonder if that's the same translation as the one that's in the great books. Tacitus, Cornelius Tacitus. Start getting into the Romans. Plutarch, Virgil, Lucretius, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. BC. It's great that they put this together. I mean, supposedly that's ancient Greece and Rome are the civilizations that influenced the founding fathers of America. So you would hope that some American would create a curriculum that, or at least a set of books that preserved their teachings. They must have all known Greek and Latin. A lot of those guys. Well, I suppose they could have had translations back then. Thomas Jefferson. George Washington, Ben Franklin. All right. Dang. 54? 54 volumes. when people read Summa Theologica. It looks like they're just suggesting certain sections. I guess if you're in the habit of study, there's no shortage of stuff you can focus on with this set. I don't think it's that important to do it, but if it's something you like to do, just to like get your day started, I guess. At least there's a lot of content. Get the synapses firing. Also, something about it makes you feel like less bad about, just consuming garbage content for the rest of the day. Like Asmongold or something. Or Mr. Beast or whatever.